They laughed at him when he limped into the bar, an old cowboy in a torn coat, too quiet to fight back. They mocked his silence, shoved at his stool, and called him nothing more than a washed-up drifter. But when a small leather case hit the floor and snapped open, the room froze. Inside lay a truth no one could deny, a Medal of Honor, carried by a man who had given more than they could ever imagine. What happened next silenced every voice, and left the bar forever changed. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The door swung open on hinges that had seen too many winters, creaking against the dry desert air that slipped inside with the newcomer. The bar was dim, washed in the yellow glow of neon signs advertising beers that hadn't been cold for hours. Harlan Briggs stepped in slowly, as though the heat of the Nevada highway still clung to his bones. His hat, the kind worn long before cowboy hats became costumes, sat low across his forehead, shading a face carved by sun and time. His boots were layered in a crust of desert dust, the kind that spoke a mile's walk when man had no other way to travel. Each step left faint prints on the warped floorboards, and when the light caught his leg just right, the limp was unmistakable. At first, no one paid much mind. The bar was full of regulars, men in work shirts smelling faintly of hay and gasoline, women hunched over drinks they'd ordered hours ago, and a few ranch hands playing pool with the easy arrogance of those who believed the room belonged to them. But as Harlan crossed the threshold, their laughter began to shift. It wasn't loud or cruel yet, just the kind of chuckles men give when they think they've spotted someone out of place. A stranger in a town where everyone knew each other. Harlan didn't look at them. His eyes, gray and steady, flicked once toward the counter at the far end of the bar. Without a word, he made his way there, his limp more pronounced as he dragged his boot slightly before planting it. The sound was soft but noticeable, a scraping across the old wood floor. Behind the counter, the bartender, a thick-set man in his 40s with sleeves rolled up to the elbow, gave him a quick scan. Hat, dust, limp, worn coat with the elbows thinning. A drifter, another old cowboy hanging on to a past that had long since left him behind. The first laugh came from the pool table. One of the younger men leaned on his cue, smirking as Harlan passed. "Look what the desert blew in," he said, his words loud enough for the room. His friends snickered, emboldened by the attention. Harlan didn't break stride. He lowered himself onto the farthest stool at the counter, the wood creaking under his weight. His hand brushed the bar top, feeling the sticky rings of spilled drinks. He nodded once at the bartender. "Coffee," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the gravel of age and distance. The bartender blinked, surprised at the order. Most men came for whiskey, beer, anything to burn away the dust of the day. But this one asked for coffee. The smirk returned to bartender's lips as he reached for the pot that had been sitting too long on the burner. He poured it anyway, sliding the chipped mug across. Behind Harlan, the laughter grew louder, more pointed now. "Careful," another voice called. "Might fall off that stool with that limp." The sound of the cue ball cracking against the rack punctuated the jeer. No one had approached him yet, but the tone in the room had shifted. Conversations that had once been scattered across tables now circled back to him, the stranger with the dust on his boots and silence in his mouth. Harlan wrapped his hands around the mug. They were broad hands, knotted with veins, the skin lined and scarred. He lifted the coffee, took a slow sip, and set it down again without a word. His hat brim stayed low, shielding his eyes from their stares. He didn't meet their mockery with fire or even acknowledgement. He simply sat, breathing in the smell of burnt coffee and cigarette smoke, the hum of neon sign buzzing faintly over his shoulder. The men at the pool table laughed again, louder this time, convinced silence meant weakness. The bartender smirked and shook his head, muttering something about drifters under his breath. Yet through it all, Harlan remained still. The limp had drawn their attention. The dust on his boots fed their jokes. But none of them noticed the quiet steadiness in his posture, the way he carried himself not as a man beaten down, but as one who had carried weight heavier than mockery and survived. The desert silence followed him inside, and though they filled it with laughter, it clung to him still. The stool at the far end of the counter was scarred from decades of elbows and spilled drinks, its padding long since collapsed into hard wood. Harlan lowered himself onto it with the slow precision of a man who had learned to mask pain with patience. The limp that carried him across the barroom floor settled into the quiet ache of his bones, but his expression never changed. He set his hat brim low, shielding his face from the glow of the neon beer sign that flickered unevenly above. From here, he could see the mirror behind the counter, its surface smeared with fingerprints and streaks of cleaner that hadn't finished the job. It offered him a reflection of the room without the need to turn his head, a habit he had cultivated long ago, always knowing where the danger was without ever looking like he searched for it. The bartender shuffled over, wiping his hands on a rag already too dirty to be of much use. He was a heavy-set man with tired eyes, his shirt stretched across a chest that spoke of muscles softening into middle age. He took one glance at Harlan, at the coat frayed along the seams, at the boots gray with desert dust, and his jaw tightened. The type was familiar, a man who had seen too many wanderers stumble in, order a cheap drink, and leave behind nothing but trouble. He stopped in front of Harlan, rags still working the surface of the counter, as though polishing away the stranger's presence. "What'll it be?" the bartender asked, though his tone carried little hospitality. Harlan lifted his head just enough that his eyes caught the man's without revealing more than he wanted. "Coffee," he said, his voice low, steady. Gravel rolled into syllables. The bartender blinked once, taken off guard. He had expected whiskey or the cheapest beer on tap. Coffee wasn't what men ordered here, not at this hour, not when the neon clock on the wall had just clicked past 9. He turned to the stained glass pot that had been burning since the afternoon, poured the dark liquid into a chipped white mug, and slid it across the counter. The smell of scorched grounds filled the air. "Drifters and their coffee," the bartender muttered, just loud enough for the words to hang between them. "Never have the money for anything better." The words didn't sting, at least not outwardly. Harlan wrapped his scarred hands around the mug, the warmth seeping into fingers that still bore the faint tremor of old wounds. He lifted it, took a careful sip, and set it back down without comment. His silence was its own shield, a wall that had stood against far worse than careless insults. Down the bar, a pair of ranch hands caught the bartender's words and chuckled. One elbowed the other, nodding toward the stranger at the far stool. "Ain't he a sight? Bet he don't have 2 nickels to rub together." Their laughter was low, but carried. It always carried in a room where pride was cheap and cruelty cheaper. The bartender leaned on the counter, studying the man who had asked for nothing but burnt coffee. He was waiting for some sign, defensiveness, anger, a story to justify the dust and the limp. But Harlan gave him none. He kept his hat low, his shoulders squared, and his attention fixed on the swirling surface of the drink before him, as though it alone deserved his patience. The ragged coat draped from his shoulders gave no hint of what concealed, only the impression of poverty and wear to the others in the room. He was just another shadow passing through, destined to fade back into the desert. Yet to the boy by the window who watched him quietly, there was something in the stillness of the man at the counter, something the laughter and mutters hadn't yet pierced. The boy saw a figure holding his silence with purpose, not shame, though no one else cared to notice. The pool game resumed with a crack of the cue ball, followed by fresh laughter. The bartender turned away, muttering again about drifters and empty pockets. Harlan lifted the mug once more, and in the reflection of the bar's grimy mirror, he saw their jeers without needing to look back. He drank his coffee and waited, not for their acceptance, but for the moment he knew was coming, the moment when the mask of their amusement would falter. The crack of the cue ball carried across the room, sharp against the low hum of the jukebox and the clink of glasses. The group around the pool table had been drinking since before sundown, their laughter already too loud, their swagger sharpened by cheap whiskey. They wore the dust of ranch work on their boots, though their shirts were cleaner than the sweat-stained days suggested. These were men who worked hard enough to brag about it, and drank even harder to make sure everyone in the room heard their boasting. One of them, broad-shouldered with a red bandana tied loosely around his neck, leaned over the table to line up his shot. His eyes flicked toward the far stool where Harlan sat with his coffee, and a smirk curved across his mouth. "Look at that one," he said, cue balanced across the felt. Old-timers got one foot in the grave, and the other slipping on sawdust. The shot cracked, scattering balls across the table, and his friends erupted with laughter before the balls had even settled. Another, younger and leaner, twirled his cue stick like a baton and nodded toward Harlan's crooked stance at the counter. But he can't stand straight without that stool holding him up. Might keel over if the wind picks up. His grin was wide, teeth flashing in the neon glow, his words deliberate enough to carry across the room. Harlan lifted the mug to his lips, slow and steady, his hat brim never rising. He didn't turn his head, didn't offer the smallest reaction to them. It was proof enough that their words had found their mark, even if silence was all they got in return. The third man, heavier, with a face flushed from drink, leaned both elbows on his cue and squinted to the haze of cigarette smoke. Man still wearing the same coat he rode in with back in '62. Faded things holding together better than he is. The group howled again, their laughter echoing too loudly in the bar's small space. The bartender glanced toward the counter, where Harlan sat. He gave the faintest shake of his head, but he didn't speak. Mockery wasn't new in a place like this, and he had long ago stopped wasting breath trying to cool it. Better to let words roll off and fade than risk a fight breaking out over pride. Harlan set the mug down carefully, the soft thud of ceramic on would almost swallowed by the noise from the pool table. His hands, scarred and calloused, rested lightly around the cup. He shifted once on the stool, not to turn or rise, but to ease the pressure in his leg where the limp burned hottest when he sat too long. The movement was enough for the ranch hands to notice. "See that?" one of them called out. "Old-timer's got to rearrange his bones just to sit still. Past his prime, I tell you, past his prime by 30 years. They laughed again, and one tapped the cue ball against the table edge like a drumbeat for their jeering chorus. To anyone else, it might have seemed like nothing, just a few drunk ranch hands amusing themselves at another man's expense. But in the way their voices carried, in the sharpness of their tone, there was more than humor. There was a need to belittle, to prove strength by pointing out weakness in someone else. They watched him for reaction, for a spark of anger or shame, the moment they could push further. But Harlan gave them nothing. He sat in his silence as though it were armor, as though the lines in his face and the limp in his gait were not burdens, but truths he had long since made peace with. The laughter rolled off him, just as bullets once had missed their mark, close enough to rattle, but never enough to bring him down. The boy by the window, Eli, kept his eyes on the pool table, but his ears tuned to the counter. He watched the way the old man held himself against their mockery. There was no twitch of anger, no nervous fidgeting. Just stillness, steady as stone, broken only by the faint rise and fall of breath. Eli sketched with a quick hand, pencil capturing the crooked stance they mocked, though his lines suggested something they missed, a weight carried with purpose, not weakness. The laughter from the pool table grew louder, spilling into every corner of the bar. They were certain they had marked their prey, certain the old cowboy was nothing but shell a man whose best days were buried under the desert sands. What they did not yet know, what none of them were prepared to see, was that silence could be heavier than words, and the man they mocked had already survived battles none of them could imagine. The bar carried the weight of years in its walls. The first thing to greet anyone stepping inside wasn't the patrons or the noise, but the smell, a thick blend of cigarette smoke ground into wood, beer gone sour in the cracks of floor, and a lingering bite of cheap whiskey that never quite left the air. It was the kind of scent that clung to clothes long after you walked out, a signature of places built for men who worked too hard to care about polish. The walls, once painted a pale cream, had long since surrendered the stains of tobacco and dust. Near the ceiling, smoke had curled itself into permanent shadows, leaving the plaster yellowed and uneven. Overhead, neon lights buzzed with the lazy hum of age. A beer sign flickered unevenly, its glow sputtering between dim and bright, as though caught in its own hesitation. A jukebox leaned against the far wall, its glass cracked near the top where some long-forgotten fight had ended badly. From it came a low country song, the kind that rolled slow and sad, about men leaving, women waiting, and roads that never led home. The volume was low enough to be background, but the melody drifted into the pauses between laughter and the clatter of pool balls, wrapping the room in something that felt both lonely and familiar. The floor was littered with sawdust, meant to soak up spilled drinks and hide the weary years. Every step stirred it faintly, releasing the faint, earthy scent beneath the stronger haze of alcohol. Boots tapped and shuffled across it, leaving trails toward the counter, the pool table, or the booths lining the wall. Those boots sagged under their own weight, their vinyl torn in places to reveal yellowed stuffing. Couples and loners leaned back in them, shoulders hunched, drinks in hand, carrying on with conversations too small to matter beyond the moment. Behind the counter, rows of bottles stood like tired soldiers, their labels curling at the edges, many filled with the cheapest brands a man could buy. The glass shelves were streaked from years of careless wiping, and the mirror that backed them reflected the room in ghostly shapes, blurred by grime. It caught the faces of the men around the pool table, the smoke twisting between them, the sharp edges of cue sticks pointing in all directions like a scatter of rifles left at rest. Above the counter, a ceiling fan turned slowly, its blades clicking faintly each time they passed the loose fixture that held it. The movement stirred the smoke only enough to keep it from settling, spreading it thin across the room rather than clearing it away. A faint draft leaked to the door frame whenever someone entered, pulling in desert air that mixed uneasily with the stale heaviness inside. The bar's heart was in its noise, not the kind that shook the walls, but the layered sounds of a place where men went to forget. Glasses clinked, low conversations hummed, and every so often a burst of laughter cut through like a whip. The pool table provided its own rhythm, the sharp crack of cue against ball followed by the rolling clatter of collisions. The jukebox's weary voice threaded through it all, singing of regrets and distances, of promises broken long before the men here were born. At the far end of the counter, Harlan sat unmoved, part of the scenery now. His coat, his boots, his hat, they matched the bar in their worn, unpolished state. Around him, the air thickened with smoke, and the smell of whiskey seemed to lean heavier near his stool. He did not drink it, but its ghost hung close all the same, as if the years he carried had soaked him in the scent whether he chose it or not. The bar was not pretty. It was not welcoming in the sense of warmth or light, but it was honest in its decay, a place where no one expected better than what they saw. For the men around the pool table, it was a stage where they could throw their jabs and raise their voices without consequence. For Harlan, it was another stop on a road that had stretched too long. The smoke and the whiskey and the faint song from the jukebox settled over him like a blanket of memory, heavy but familiar, while the rest of the room laughed and drank, blind to the silence he carried with him. The game of pool had slowed, not because the men had grown tired, but because their attention had shifted. The stranger at the far stool had become the evening's entertainment, his silence an open invitation for ridicule. Clayton Murdoch, the youngest of the group and the loudest by nature, set his sights on the old cowboy with the same reckless eagerness he brought to every fight he thought he could win. He was in his mid-20s, broad in the shoulders, with a restless energy that came from too many drinks and too much need to prove himself. He lined up a shot, missed badly, and laughed it off before swinging his cue stick upright like a staff. With a sudden crack, he brought it down against the sawdust-coated floor, the sound echoing sharp across the bar and pulling every set of eyes toward him. The jukebox carried on with its lonely song, but its notes seemed thinner now against the force of Clayton's noise. He pointed the cue like a spear toward the counter, toward the quiet figure who had yet to respond to anything. "Hey, old-timer," Clayton called out, voice loud enough to cut across the smoke and chatter. "You planning to drink that coffee all night, or are you going to buy a real round for the men who work for a living?" His grin stretched wide, teeth bared in triumph as if he had already landed a blow. The ranch hands around him laughed, some pounding their cues against the edge of the table in approval. The bartender looked up from wiping glasses, his mouth tightening. He had seen this before, seen it many times. Young men fueled by liquor and bravado, circling someone they thought was weaker, someone who wouldn't fight back. It was trouble waiting to happen, but he didn't speak yet. Harlan lifted his mug, the steam long gone from the coffee, and took another slow sip. His hat brim shadowed his face, but his eyes shifted just slightly toward the mirror behind the counter, catching Clayton's reflection in the glass. He set the mug down without hurry, his hand steady despite the sting of the words thrown his way. Clayton smacked the cue against the floor again, the thud reverberating through the old boards. "Come on, Grandpa," he pressed, leaning forward with exaggerated swagger. "Bet you don't even got enough coins in that pocket to buy yourself a shot. let alone around for men who can still stand straight. His friends roared with laughter, their voices bouncing off the nicotine-stained walls. The boy by the window, Eli, flinched at the sound. His pencil hovered above his sketchbook as he glanced between the pool table and the old man at the counter. He waited for some reaction, some flash of anger or shame, but none came. The old cowboy didn't so much as shift in his stool. He simply breathed, calm and even, as though the noise belonged to another world altogether. Clayton wasn't satisfied. He wanted a crack in the silence, something to prove he'd gotten under the man's skin. He turned to the others and laughed, raising his voice so the whole bar could hear. Maybe he spent his last dollar just getting here. Maybe he's waiting for charity. You got charity, bartender? Or you gonna let that fossil drink burnt coffee till he keels over? The bartender's rag slowed across the glass in his hand. He said nothing, but his eyes flicked toward Harlan. There was a tension there, not quite pity, not quite fear. Something closer to the wary respect of a man who knew better than to underestimate what he didn't understand. Clayton slammed his cue down once more, and the floor shook faintly under the blow. Well, you deaf, old man? Show us what you got, or admit you're just sitting here taking up space. His voice had lost some of its playfulness, edged now with the sharpness of someone pushing too far, too fast. Harlan finally moved. He reached into his coat pocket slowly, every motion deliberate, and drew out a few coins. They clinked against the counter as he slid them forward, not toward the men at the pool table, but toward the bartender. Another coffee, he said quietly, the words steady as stone. The laughter from the pool table erupted again, cruel and unrestrained. Clayton grinned, satisfied he had forced something out of the man, even if it was only a few coins for more burnt coffee. Yet beneath the noise, the bar had shifted. Some of the older patrons leaned back in their booths, watching now with eyes sharpened by something other than amusement. They had seen silence before, seen what it often concealed. And though Clayton and his friends mocked louder, louder still, the quiet figure at the counter did not bend. The laughter rose and fell like a tide, swelling with each cruel remark before breaking into scattered chuckles that echoed off the bar's stained walls. Yet through it all, Harlan remained still, anchored to his stool as though the noise around him were nothing more than the wind outside. His hands rested against the chipped white mug, fingers curled around it with a steadiness that belonged to men who had known storms and outlasted them. The bar's dim light revealed what the jeering voices refused to see. The skin of his hands was not smooth, not soft. It was weathered, the ridges of age running deep as dried riverbeds across his knuckles. Faded scars crossed over one another, pale lines etched by years of rope burns and barbed wire, by the bite of reins gripped too tightly on restless horses, by the steel heat of rifle barrels carried longer than any man should have to carry them. The nails were uneven, darkened at the edges by dust that no amount of scrubbing ever seemed to erase. They were hands that told the truth of a life lived far beyond the comfort of neon lights and sawdust floors. When he lifted the mug, the movement was slow, deliberate, his fingers tightening with a quiet strength. He didn't flinch at their words. He didn't speak in his own defense. He simply held that mug, the warmth of the bitter coffee seeping into calloused palms, as if it were the only thing in the room that mattered. The steam had thinned long ago, but the habit of holding on to it, holding steady, remained. Clayton Murdoch's grin faltered for just a moment as his eyes fell on those hands. The mockery in his voice had been built on the image of an old man, brittle and fragile, a figure easy to dismiss. But the scars were not the marks of weakness. They were evidence, proof written into the skin of work and war and survival. Clayton shook it off quickly, raising his voice louder than before, trying to drown out the unease that had crept in. His friends laughed again, yet their glances were shorter now, darting back toward the counter where the cowboy sat, silent and unyielding. The bartender poured the refill, sliding the pot across with less disdain than before. He noticed the way Harlan's hands gripped the mug, steady as stone, unbothered by the words thrown across the room. There was something in those fingers, in the quiet patience of them, that made a man think twice. He didn't say it aloud, but the bartender poured the coffee with more care this time, setting it down gently, as though he had begun to recognize that the man sitting before him was not just another drifter with nothing left. Eli, the boy by the window, kept sketching, his pencil scratching furiously as he tried to capture the hands before the image slipped away. He ignored the faces of the laughing ranch hands, ignored their mocking smiles, and focused only on the lines of those fingers around the mug. He saw strength in them, the kind of strength that wasn't loud or showy, but real, carved into bone and sinew. His hand trembled as he drew, not from fear, but from the weight of realizing that some truths didn't need words. The laughter from the pool table swelled again, desperate and hollow. Clayton banged his cue against the floor, trying to pull attention back to himself, trying to reignite the mockery that had begun to thin. But Harlan did not answer. He did not shift or look their way. His silence filled the space more powerfully than their noise, his grip on the mug a quiet defiance. The jukebox played on, its sad country song weaving into the smoke and haze. The smell of whiskey thickened. Boots shuffled across sawdust, and the neon sign buzzed faintly above. Yet in that small corner of the counter, where an old cowboy's scarred hands rested around a chipped mug, the room carried a stillness no one wanted to name. It was the kind of stillness that unsettled men who had never seen what those scars had seen. The noise at the pool table swelled until it seemed to press against the walls themselves, voices thick with drink and arrogance. Clayton Murdoch leaned back on his cue stick like it was a throne, his grin widening each time the old cowboy at the counter failed to answer. Silence to him was proof enough, proof of weakness, proof of defeat. He fed on it, throwing more words into the haze just to hear them echo back in laughter. "Look at him," Clayton called, loud enough for every ear in the bar. "Can't even raise his head, but he ain't got the breath left to speak." Coffee and silence, that's all the old-timers good for now. The words cracked like whips, meant to sting, meant to break something inside. The others joined in, eager to ride the wave of his cruelty. One mimicked the limp he had seen when Harlan crossed the floor, dragging his boot in the sawdust for crowd's amusement. Another raised his voice in a mock groan, pretending to strain under invisible years. The laughter that followed was loud and mean, spilling over itself in fits that shook shoulders and slapped hands against the table. Harlan did not flinch. He sat with his hat brim shading his face, hands still wrapped around the mug that had grown cool in his grip. To him, the laughter was no different than the buzzing neon above or the stale smoke in the air, annoying, unavoidable, but hardly worth more than a passing glance. The lines on his face stayed carved in stone, his posture unbending. He let them laugh. He let them believe. The bartender shifted uneasily behind the counter, polishing a glass that was already clean. He kept his eyes low, but he listened. He heard the laughter, the cruel imitation of a limp, the mocking words. He also heard the silence, and it unsettled him more than the noise. Men who shouted, who cursed and swung fists were easy enough to read. Silence was heavier. It carried history. It carried weight. And the bartender, though he said nothing, knew that weight when he saw it. Eli sat stiff in his corner, his pencil pressed so hard against the page it threatened to tear through. He drew the outline of the man at the counter, the stooped figures around the pool table, the laughter etched into their mouths. But he paused at the old man's face. He left it blank on the page, because silence wasn't something you could sketch. It was something you felt, something that shifted the room even as the others mistook it for emptiness. Clayton slapped the table, his laughter rolling out again, his friends quick to follow. Hear that? Nothing. Not a word. Old-timer knows he's beat before the game even started. He said it like a victory, like silence with submission. His eyes flashed, hungry for more, for the sound of the bar joining in, for the confirmation that he was king of this moment. But beneath the noise, something lingered, an unease too quiet to name. It passed in glances. An older man in a booth who had once worn a uniform, a woman at the bar who had seen too many drifters come and go. They did not laugh. They watched. They watched the way the old cowboy's silence wasn't slumped or broken, but still, straight-backed, unbothered. They watched and felt the faint chill of knowing there was more in that quiet than Clayton or his friends could understand. The laughter grew louder, desperate in its need to fill the silence it could not touch. Every cruel joke, every raised voice was a shield against something the men at the pool table didn't want to admit. That the man they mocked wasn't weak, wasn't afraid. He was simply waiting, and waiting, in its own way, was more dangerous than any word spoken. The bartender had watched the room turn the way a man watches clouds gather over dry land, knowing the storm was coming whether anyone believed it or not. He had seen this pattern too many times and too many nights. Mockery that began as harmless noise but thickened into something sharp, a weapon meant to push a man, until he either broke or bled. He kept polishing the glass in his hands, though it didn't need polishing, his rag moving in tight circles, his jaw set. His eyes flicked from the pool table to the old cowboy at the end of the counter, the silence still holding steady against the laughter. He leaned closer, lowering his voice so it wouldn't carry, though he knew even whispers had a way of reaching ears in a place like this. "You ought to finish that coffee and head out," he muttered, keeping his face turned toward the glass in his hand. "These boys don't let things stay quiet too long." Harlan didn't move. His hand remained on the mug, fingers resting along its chipped handle, the faint steam gone cold by now. He didn't look up, didn't nod, or acknowledge the words. The bartender frowned, set the glass down, and leaned a little closer, lowering his voice further. "I've seen it before. Drifters come in, think they can keep their head down, just pass through. But once the noise starts, it don't stop. Not till someone's shoved out the door, or worse. You don't want to be the one they decide to make an example of." The cowboy finally raised his eyes. Not all the way. Not enough to meet the bartenders fully, but just enough that the shadow of the hat brim lifted to reveal gray irises dulled by time, but still steady, still sharp in their own quiet way. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The look was enough to give the bartender pause, enough to remind him that some men weren't easily warned. From the pool table came another burst of laughter, sharper this time, tinged with that hungry edge that meant the teasing had become sport. Clayton's voice rose above the rest, brash and unrelenting. "Bet the old man's getting his bedtime warning now." Bartenders telling him to go find a cot. The others howled, pounding their cues against the table, their boots against the sawdust floor. The bartender straightened, his face hardening. He had tried. He had offered the warning he always gave when the crowd began to circle, when the tension grew like heat in the desert air. Most men listened. Most men slipped out the door with heads bowed, deciding it was easier to swallow pride than face fists. But this one, he could already tell, wasn't like most. There was no shifting uneasily on the stool, no glance toward the door, no restless hands fumbling for escape. Just that same stillness, that same grip on the mug, as though he had rooted himself to the spot. "You don't get it," the bartender muttered again, his voice sharper now, tinged with the frustration of a man who knew he was wasting his breath. "These boys, they don't stop. They don't want you quiet. They want a reaction. And if you don't give them one, they'll drag it out of you." Last drifter that came through, well, he didn't leave on his own 2 feet. Harlan blinked once, slow, as if the words washed over him like wind over stone. He lifted the mug, took a drink of the bitter coffee that had gone lukewarm, and set it back down. His silence was not ignorance. It was choice. The bartender saw it then, recognized it for what it was, and it unsettled him more than the laughter from the pool table. The jukebox rolled into another song, something faster but no less sad, a voice singing about highways and leaving behind what couldn't be fixed. The sound seemed to underline the warning, but Harlan didn't move. He stayed where he was, while Clayton and his friends circled with their laughter, convinced they had cornered an old man too weak to stand. The bartender shook his head, muttered something under his breath about fools and pride, and went back to his glasses, though his eyes flicked constantly toward the stool at the far end. He had offered the chance to leave. He had spoken the words he always spoke. But in his gut, he knew this night would not end like the others. This drifter was different. This silence carried weight. And though he couldn't have explained why, the bartender felt it clear as the smoke in the air. The ones laughing were the ones who ought to be warned, not the man sitting quietly at the counter. Eli Turner had chosen the corner by the window not because it was comfortable, but because it gave him the best view. The glass was streaked with dust from the desert wind, its frame warped with age. But enough of the outside world slipped through to catch the faint glow of passing headlights and the occasional shadow of a truck lumbering down the highway. The boy sat hunched at the small table, his elbows pressing into the scarred wood as he leaned over a sketchbook too worn for its age. The edges of the paper curled. The cover had long since lost its stiffness, but it was his most prized possession. With a pencil gripped tightly in his hand, he studied the old cowboy at the counter with the intensity of someone who saw more than most people cared to notice. Eli was no stranger to this bar. His uncle worked the door on weekends, and his mother sometimes took shifts serving drinks when the bills grew too heavy. He had spent more nights than he cared to count sitting in that same corner, his sketchbook open, drawing the faces of men who never knew they were being drawn. Usually, the subjects blurred together, red-dyed from whiskey, mouths twisted in laughter too loud to be real, eyes vacant and tired. But tonight was different. Tonight, his pencil kept coming back to the man in the dust-covered boots and frayed coat, the one who hadn't spoken since he sat down. While the others laughed and jeered, Eli's eyes traced the cowboy's hands wrapped around a chipped mug, the scar lines etched deep into the skin. He drew them carefully, letting the pencil follow each ridge and curve, not as decoration but as story. Those hands didn't belong to weakness, no matter how many times Clayton and the others tried to paint him as a relic. They belonged to someone who had worked, fought, endured. Eli didn't know the details. He didn't need to. The scars told him enough. The boy's curiosity stretched beyond the hands. He sketched the slope of the shoulders beneath the ragged coat, the brim of the hat pulled low to shield a face from the neon glare. What Louis glimpsed of the cowboy's jaw was square, the lines sharp with age but still strong. Eli didn't see a man hiding. He saw a man who had learned to live with shadows. There was a difference, and it was one the ranch hands were too blind or too drunk to understand. From the pool table came another burst of laughter. Louder, sharper, meant to pierce the quiet figure at the counter. Eli flinched at the noise, his pencil slipping across the page, but he quickly corrected it, turning the mistake into shading around the hat's brim. His eyes darted back to the cowboy. No reaction, no flicker, just the same stillness, as if the noise belonged to another world entirely. It made Eli's chest tighten in a way he didn't have words for. He had heard the bartender mutter his warning, low and gruff, the same warning he had given others before. Eli knew what it meant. He had seen men stumble out of this bar with blood on their lips and anger on their faces. But this one didn't look like he would stumble. He looked like he would stay planted, no matter what storm broke around him. That thought unsettled Eli even as it drew his pencil faster across the paper. The boy shifted in his seat, turning a page to sketch the whole figure now. He outlined the limp in the stance he had seen earlier, the slow drag of the boot across the floor. But he didn't draw it as weakness. He drew it as weight, the kind a man carried when he had lived through things no one in that bar could name. His friends at school would have joined the laughter if they were here, tossing words like fossil and cripple without thinking twice. But Eli wasn't laughing. He felt the pull of something different, something that made him want to capture this moment before it was lost. The old cowboy wasn't just another drifter passing through. He was a story, and Eli Turner, with his pencil scratching against the page, was determined to be the one who kept it. Behind him, the men around the pool table shouted again, their voices filling the bar like smoke. But Eli tuned them out. He focused only on the lines he was carving into the paper and the silence that held steady at the counter. Whatever the others thought they saw, the boy by the window saw something else entirely. A man not broken, but unyielding, carrying truths that silence could never erase. The pool game lost its rhythm, the laughter no longer tied to the roll of balls or the sharp crack of a cue. Clayton Murdoch tossed his stick against the wall and nodded to his friends, his smirk widening with every step he took toward the counter. The others followed, emboldened by drink and the thrill of circling a target. Their boots dragged across the floor, stirring the sawdust into little clouds that caught in the dim neon light. The sound was low at first, grinding, scraping, a rhythm of leather and grit, but as they drew closer, it became the beat of intimidation. Harlan didn't turn. His hand stayed on the mug, steady as ever, though his ears caught the sound as clearly as gunfire. He knew the cadence of men closing in. He had heard it before, boots moving over dirt, over gravel, over ground that smelled of blood and dust. The floorboard of the bar might have been different, but the rhythm was the same. He let it come, his silence holding like a wall, not out of defiance, but because he had no reason to move for the likes of them. Clayton stopped a few feet short of the stool, his friends fanning out behind him, Their shadows fell across the counter, stretching long in a haze of smoke and neon glow. He tilted his head, eyeing the cowboy's bent back and hat brim, then spat a laugh through his teeth. "All right, old-timer, you sat there quiet long enough. Time you told us who you really are. You some broke-down ranch hand? Some runaway who left his herd to rot? What's the story?" The men around him chuckled, stamping their boots against the floor, grinding the sawdust deeper as if to drive home their control of the moment. One leaned in closer, the smell of whiskey heavy on his breath. "Or maybe you're nobody, just another drifter sitting where he don't belong." He shoved his boot against the leg of Harlan's stool, rocking it slightly, enough to draw another round of laughter. Still, Harlan didn't speak. He let their words fall and scatter like seeds on rock, finding no soil to root in. His grip on the mug tightened only enough to keep it from slipping, the scarred lines of his hand white against the porcelain. His shoulders stayed square, his posture calm. Silence stretched again, thick enough that the jukebox's slow country tune seemed louder, as if the singer's voice was filling the space the cowboy refused to give. Clayton leaned forward now, both hands pressed against the counter. "Come on, old man. We've all got names here. We've all got stories. What's yours? Or are you too scared to say it?" He jerked his head toward his friends, drawing another chorus of jeers. "But he's just a washed-up fool with nothing left but coffee stains." Eli watched from the corner, his pencil paused midline. His chest tightened as he saw them surround the cowboy, their boots cutting into the sawdust like predators circling prey. Yet Harlan remained unchanged, unshaken. The boy's hand moved again, sketching the figures of the young men towering over him. But he left the cowboy still as stone at the center, untouched by the noise and the heat pressing in around him. The bartender set down his rag with a sigh, eyes narrowing. He knew what came next, knew this was a point where words would turn to hands, hands to fists, fists to blood. He opened his mouth as if to intervene, then shut it again. He had warned the old man. That was all he ever did. The rest, as always, was out of his hands. The boots ground harder now, sawdust crunching under their weight, their movements circling him tighter. One of the ranch hands kicked at the floor, sending up a small spray of grit toward Harlan's boots. "Don't stay quiet now," he sneered. "Tell us who you are, or we'll make sure you don't forget who we are." The old cowboy's head lifted just a fraction, the brim of his hat shifting enough to catch the faint neon light. His eyes, though still shadowed, glinted gray beneath it, calm and unflinching. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The silence itself became his answer, heavier than the noise of all their voices combined. The young men mistook it still for weakness, laughing louder, stamping their boots into the sawdust with a force meant to remind him that he was surrounded. They didn't see the truth sitting in front of them, didn't hear what silence can carry. Eli did. The bartender suspected. But the rest of the bar only saw a quiet man at the counter, pressing on all sides, and assumed the story was theirs to write. Clayton had never been patient. He thrived on noise, on the satisfaction of forcing a reaction where none came willingly. The old cowboy's silence gnawed at him more than he wanted to admit. Every second Harlan sat still at the counter felt like a challenge, a refusal that made the laughter around the pool table feel hollow. Clayton wanted something he could point to, something that proved his words had weight. He stepped in closer, his boots grinding into the sawdust with the sound of grit on grit. "Enough of the quiet act," he muttered, his voice carrying for the room, though it was meant for the man before him. His hand shot out before anyone could stop him, seizing the edge of the cowboy's coat where it hung loose at the shoulder. The fabric gave beneath his grip, the years were showing themselves all at once. With a sharp tug, Clayton yanked, and the sound of ripping cloth tore through the bar louder than any burst of laughter that had come before. The coat split at the seam, thread snapping, fabric tearing wide. The laughter that had filled the room stalled, just for a heartbeat, as if even the men who had cheered him on hadn't expected him to go that far. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft thud of something small hitting the floor. A leather case, scuffed and worn, slid across the sawdust before stopping at the toe of Clayton's boot. He looked down, his grin faltering for the first time. The case wasn't big, small enough to fit in the palm of a hand, its edges rounded with age, the leather darkened by years of being carried close. It was nothing like the wallet or flask they might have expected to tumble free. The sight of it drew a shift in the room, subtle but undeniable. Conversation stilled, and even the jukebox seemed to stumble over its melody for a moment. Clayton bent slightly, reaching for it, his arrogance pulling him forward. "Well, what's this then?" he said, though his tone lacked the same sharp edge as before. His fingers brushed the leather, but before he could pick it up, Harlan's hand moved. It wasn't quick in the way of youth, but it was steady, deliberate, carrying a weight that froze Clayton where he stood. The cowboy's fingers closed over the case first, drawing it back with a quiet certainty that didn't need force to command space. The torn edge of the coat hung loose now, exposing a glimpse of the shirt beneath. The fabric there was stained in places, not with fresh dirt but with something older, marks of time, of scars not unlike the ones carved into his hands. Harlan lifted the case carefully, brushing sawdust from its surface with the edge of his thumb. He set it on the counter beside his mug, not hiding it, not rushing to tuck it away, but letting it sit in plain view where the light could catch the outline of its brass clasp. Clayton forced a laugh, but it came out thinner than before. "Just an old box," he said, his voice pitched higher to reach his friends, probably carrying the last of his pennies. The others chuckled weakly, their laughter no longer ringing with the same ease. Their eyes affixed on the case, and something in the air shifted around it. Eli Turner sat forward in his seat, his pencil hovering above the page. He didn't draw. He only watched. He had seen plenty of men mocked, plenty shoved and stripped of dignity in this bar. But he had never seen silence turn a room like this. The old cowboy hadn't raised a hand, hadn't spoken a word, but the leather case on the counter carried more weight than all the jeering combined. The bartender exhaled through his nose, slow and quiet. He knew what such cases sometimes held. He had seen a few in his time, usually brought in by men who carried stories they never told out loud. His rag stilled against the glass in his hand. He didn't speak, didn't move closer, but his eyes lingered on the case with a respect he had not shown the man before. Clayton shifted uneasily, though he tried to mask it with another shove of his boot through the sawdust. "Go on then," he pushed, his voice unsteady in its eagerness. "Open it up. Let's see what kind of treasure you think you're hiding." His words lacked the bite of before, as though even he wasn't sure he wanted to see the answer. Harlan didn't oblige him. He didn't rush, didn't rise to the challenge. He simply rested his scarred hand on top of the case, fingers splayed lightly, as though reminding the room that what was his would remain his until he chose otherwise. His silence deepened, filling the cracks in the bar's noise, and for the first time that night, the laughter no longer seemed certain it could smother him. The case sat on the counter, like it had its own gravity, pulling every eye in the room toward it. Harlan's hand rested lightly on the worn leather, his fingers tracing the edge as though weighing whether to leave it closed. The sawdust stirred faintly under the shuffle of boots as Clayton shifted, trying to mask his unease with bravado. "Go on, old man," he pressed, his voice sharp but thinner than before. "Let's see what kind of keepsake you're hiding." The others murmured in agreement, though less certain now, their laughter replaced by a nervous anticipation. The bartender said nothing, but his hand still completely, the rag forgotten against the rim of a half-clean glass. Eli Turner's pencil hovered above his sketchbook, suspended midair, as if the lead itself knew it was about to record something different from every scene that had come before. With a motion neither hurried nor hesitant, Harlan slipped his thumb beneath the clasp. The soft click echoed louder than it should have, carrying into the quiet that had spread like a blanket across the bar. He lifted the lid, and the hinges creaked, stiff from years of disuse. The leather case opened fully, and what it revealed stopped every sound in the room. Resting against the faded velvet lining was a metal that time had not managed to erase. Its metal was tarnished, dull by years, but its shape was unmistakable. The star, the wreath, the detail etched into its face, all spoke to an honor greater than words. Above it hung a ribbon, once a vivid blue, now muted by dust and decades, but still intact, still whole. The medal of honor. The room froze around it. The laughter that filled the air only a moment ago vanished, as if it had never existed. The jukebox's country ballad seemed distant, faint against the weight of the silence that followed. Even the neon lights seemed to buzz softer, as though they too recognized what lay exposed on the counter. Clayton's mouth opened, but no words came. His hand twitched by his side, unsure whether to shove his cue against the floor again or shove them into his pockets to hide the tremor in his fingers. His friends stepped back slightly, their boots crunching in the sawdust, each retreat no louder than a breath. Their faces, so quick to twist in mocking grins, were pale now, eyes fixed on the tarnished metal that no drunk bravado could laugh away. The bartender was the first to move. He set down the glass he had been holding and leaned forward, his expression shifting from suspicion to something closer to regret. He had seen many tokens pass through his bar, old service pins, faded photographs, cheap trinkets carried for luck. None had ever silenced a room like this. He knew the truth of what sat there. No one carried that metal unless it was earned in blood and fire, and fewer men lived long enough to keep it. Eli's sketchbook trembled in his hands. He bent over the page, his pencil scratching furiously now, desperate to capture the image before it slipped away. He sketched the curve of the open case, the shape of the star, the ribbon's faded folds. His young eyes burned with something he didn't yet have words for, but he knew one thing. This was no drifter, no broken-down fool. This was a man who had seen and done what the rest of them could not imagine. No one laughed. No one jeered. Even Clayton's arrogance cracked under the weight of the truth displayed so plainly. The metal needed no story. Its presence alone told all there was to know, that the old cowboy had once been called to face the impossible and had not only faced it but endured. His silence now was not weakness. It was the silence of a man who had given more than any of them would ever be asked to give. Harlan closed the case gently, the soft sound of the hinge folding shut echoing like a gunshot through the stillness. He didn't look at the men who had mocked him, didn't meet their eyes or wait for their apologies. He simply returned the case to the counter, resting his scarred hand atop it once more, as if to remind them it was his to carry, his alone. The room held its breath, the sawdust thick in the air, the weight of the metal heavier than any insult that had come before. In that moment, every man in the bar understood something none of them could laugh away. They had not been mocking a drifter. They had been mocking a hero. The moment the metal showed itself, the air inside the bar shifted in a way that no one could deny. A heartbeat earlier, the room had been full of noise. Clayton's jeers, the raucous laughter of his friends, the scrape of boots grinding into sawdust. Now all of it was gone, snuffed out as though someone had drawn the air from every throat at once. The jukebox carried on with its tune, a slow country ballad that had been background noise all evening. But now its hum seemed deafening. Every note filled the stillness, every strum of the guitar sounding louder than the voices that had just been mocking a man they thought was broken. Clayton's smirk had vanished entirely. He stared at the case, his jaw working as if words wanted to come but refused to form. His friends, who had fed on his bravado moments before, were no better. Their shoulders sagged. Their boots shifted uneasily in the sawdust, and their eyes darted anywhere but the counter where the metal rested. One man coughed nervously, the sound sharp and hush, then dropped his gaze to the floor as if he'd spoken out of turn in a place where words were no longer welcome. The bartender didn't move at first. His hands stayed flat on the counter, fingers spread, eyes fixed on the tarnished star inside the case. For a man who had seen countless tokens and stories pass through his establishment, this was different. This was not a cheap trinket or some lie told to impress. He knew what it meant, what it cost to wear one. Slowly, he drew in a breath, but even that seemed loud enough to carry to the farthest corner of the room. He set his rag aside without a word, his expression heavy with something closer to respect than any of the men around him had shown all night. At the window, Eli Turner felt his chest tighten. His pencil moved across the page without him thinking, sketching the stillness, the bent heads, the case on the counter that had turned laughter into silence. His hand trembled as he drew the ribbon, its faded color captured in the shading of his pencil. He had no words for the way the room had changed, but he knew that he was watching something rare. An entire bar reminded in one instant of the difference between noise and truth. No one dared speak. The jukebox continued to hum, its song carrying lines about heartbreak and distance, and for the first time all night, no one laughed over it. The neon lights buzzed faintly above, their uneven flicker casting shadows that seemed sharper now, more defined. The air grew heavy, the smoke hanging thicker as though even had been stilled. Clayton shifted, his boots scraping against the floor, the sound far too loud for so small a movement. He swallowed hard, his throat bobbing, but still he said nothing. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room could see what had cracked inside him. The bravado, the arrogance, all of it had slipped away in the face of something he could neither mock nor diminish. The cowboy at the counter did not gloat, did not smile, did not even look at them. Harlan simply rested his hand on the case, the scars on his knuckles catching the light, and kept his silence. That silence pressed against the room harder than any words could have. It was not the silence of fear nor weakness, but a man who had lived long enough to know that what needed saying could often remain unsaid. Men shifted in their seats, women lowered their eyes to their drinks, and even the bartender found himself avoiding the cowboy's gaze. It wasn't shame alone that filled the room. It was the realization that they had been measuring themselves against a man whose scale was beyond their reach. The Medal of Honor was more than a decoration. It was a story no one else could carry, a weight that silenced even the drunkest laughter. The song on the jukebox ended, the record arm clicking faintly as it moved to the next track. That small mechanical sound cut through the stillness like a hammer strike, making a few heads jerk up in reflex. But when the next song began, its melody slow and aching, no one spoke. The bar had been reduced to the hum of machine, the buzz of neon, and the faint sound of Eli's pencil moving across the page. For the first time that night, Clayton Murdoch and his friends had nothing to say. Their noise had been stolen from them, their strength drained by a metal that said more in silence than they could in 1,000 jeers. And so the bar remained still, every man and woman caught inside the quiet that had fallen, a quiet that felt heavier than any sound they had ever known. The metal sat there in the open case, catching what little light the bar could give it, and it was enough. The star, dull by years but unmistakable, seemed brighter than any neon glow, sharp in the haze of smoke that hung in the air. Every man who had been laughing a heartbeat earlier now found his voice caught in his throat. Their expressions, once twisted in sneers and grins, hardened into something else entirely. They weren't smiles anymore. They weren't even frowns. They were frozen, eyes locked on the counter, faces pale in the realization of what they had just mocked. Clayton Murdoch was the first to move, though it was hardly movement at all. He took a step back, his boots scraping through the sawdust with a sound too loud in the still room. His grin was gone, replaced with an awkward twitch at the corner of his mouth that failed to hold. His hand, what had been so quick to tear at the old man's coat, now hovered uncertainly at his side, fingers flexing as though he didn't know what to do with them. His chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. The swagger drained out of him. His friends weren't much better. The lean one who had dragged his boot in imitation of Harlan's limp earlier now shifted uncomfortably, his shoulders hunching as if to make himself smaller. He couldn't meet the cowboy's gaze, couldn't even risk catching sight of the metal again. So his eyes darted the floor to the walls, anywhere else. The heavier one, flushed from drink and arrogance, suddenly looked as though sobriety had struck him like a bucket of cold water. His mouth hung open, but no words came. They had all seen medals before, service pins, awards worn at parades, but never this one, not the Medal of Honor. That was not something men joked about. That was not something anyone faked. Around the room, others who had been watching quietly now leaned forward, their faces shifting too. The older patrons recognized it instantly. They knew the stories, if not the man. Some had served themselves, or knew family who hadn't come home. They understood the distance between an ordinary decoration and this one. A few lowered their eyes out of respect, the mockery they had allowed to play out now pressing heavy on their conscience. The bartender let out a long breath, the weight of it cutting through the thick silence. He no longer looked at Harlan as a drifter. His gaze held something steadier, more deliberate, as though trying to see past the brim of the hat to the man beneath. The rag lay forgotten on the counter. He didn't speak, didn't need to. His face alone told the story of realization, a mixture of shame for having doubted and awe for what had been revealed. Clayton's bravado had cracked, and his friends had collapsed entirely. They stepped back further, one after the other, each shuffle of boots leaving tracks in the sawdust that looked less like intimidation and more like retreat. Their bodies, once squared in mockery, now sagged under the sudden understanding of just who they had been taunting. No one dared laugh. No one dared push further. The weight of their earlier cruelty now hung over them like a sentence they couldn't escape. Eli Turner, still in his corner, captured every detail. His pencil scratched quickly, sketching the faces of the men frozen in realization. Their widened eyes, their jaws slack, their posture faltering. He wanted to remember the way arrogance could break without a fight, how laughter could die in the face of truth. His sketch showed more than fear. It showed the shame etched into their expressions, the dawning awareness that they had mocked not just a man, but something sacred. Harlan remained still at the counter, his hand resting lightly on the closed case once more. He didn't need to speak to remind them of their mistake. The metal had done the work for him. His silence had not been weakness, and now every man in the bar knew it. The ranch hands who had circled him moments before now stood a few feet away, boots pressed into sawdust, their bravado cracked like thin glass. The jukebox played on, its melody low and mournful, filling the heavy quiet with words about sacrifice and loss. It was coincidence, but it felt fitting, almost deliberate, like the music itself had been waiting for this moment. The faces in the room told the rest of the story. Laughter replaced by guilt, arrogance hollowed out into silence, and a recognition that they had stood against a man who carried more than they could ever comprehend. Eli's hands had been steady when the jeering began. He had sketched the swagger of Clayton, the cruel tilt of the ranch hands' mouths, the quiet silhouette of the old cowboy at the counter. But now, with the metal line there in the open case, his pencil betrayed him. It trembled across the page, leaving lines that were less precise, more jagged. He tightened his grip, trying to control it, but the weight of what he was seeing pressed down too heavily. His sketchbook shook on the table, the edges bouncing softly against the wood each time his wrist tremored. He glanced around, as though to check if anyone else saw what he did. The ranch hands stood frozen, their bravado gone, their faces stripped bare by realization. Clayton's shoulders slumped, his grin of memory replaced by uncertainty. The bartender's hands, once busy with glasses, now rested firmly on the counter, his expression caught between regret and awe. No one laughed. No one dared. The only sounds were the jukebox humming its lonely song and the faint rasp of Eli's pencil dragging across the paper. But Eli knew what silence did. He knew how quickly it could vanish, how quickly men would deny what they had seen once the weight of the moment passed. By morning, they would drink away their shame, pretend the metal had been nothing more than a trick of the light, a story twisted in memory. They would say the old man had been no different from any drifter, and they would let their laughter return. He couldn't let that happen. His pencil moved faster, trying to capture every detail. The way the case looked against the sawdust, the way Harlan's scarred hand rested on it, the way the men around him had retreated into themselves. The lines blurred as his hand shook harder. He pressed the pencil so firmly that the lead snapped, a sharp crack that sounded loud in the quiet room. Eli flinched, his breath catching, but he quickly reached for another stub from the inside pocket of his jacket. His fingers fumbled, slick with sweat, but he jammed the new piece into his grip and pressed on. He sketched the cowboy's face as best as he could glimpse it, shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. He drew the sharp edges of his jaw, the lines that told of years endured rather than wasted. He drew the metal, the ribbon faded but still proud, marking the man as something more than what the ranch hands had believed. Each stroke felt like a kind of proof, the only record he could make of this night. No camera would capture it. No photograph would appear in the local paper. Only his sketchbook could hold the truth of the moment, and he knew it mattered. He was young, but he knew some things deserved to be remembered. His hand trembled so badly that he had to press the book against his chest, holding it steady as he worked. The pencil scratched, darkening shadows, deepening lines, each mark laid down with urgency. His heart pounded in his ears. He wasn't just drawing anymore. He was testifying. The metal had silenced the room, but Eli was determined to make sure the silence didn't erase it. Out of the corner of his eye, he caught Harlan shift slightly, not to look at him, but enough that Eli wondered if the old cowboy knew he was being recorded, not in words or photographs, but in the strokes of a boy's pencil. Harlan didn't stop him. He simply let the moment breathe, his silence holding steady as if to say, "Remember it if you can." The pencil slowed as Eli's breath steadied, though the tremor never fully left. He glanced at the figures around the pool table and drew them too, not as men of strength, but as men caught in shame, their faces frozen, their pride cracked. He wanted the page to hold it all, the arrogance undone, the laughter extinguished, the truth revealed in an old leather case. His sketchbook shook with every line, but still he drew, because he knew no one outside the smoky room would ever believe what had happened without proof. The silence had stretched so long it seemed almost permanent, thick as the smoke that curled beneath the ceiling. The metal rested in its case, dull with time yet glowing with a presence no one could deny. Every man in the room knew what it was, but none dared put words to it. Their laughter had died, their grins had fallen away. They stood caught in the weight of recognition, and yet some part of them still clawed for escape, for a way to lessen what the truth demanded of them. It was one of Clayton's friends, the youngest of the group, who finally broke. His voice cracked when he spoke, thin and unsteady, a stammer that revealed a fear he had been trying to swallow. "W, where'd you get that?" he asked, pointing a shaky finger toward the case. His eyes darted to the others, as though begging them to confirm what he hoped, that it wasn't real, that it wasn't earned. It ain't yours, right? Just some antique you picked up somewhere, right?" The question hung in the air, trembling with desperation. No one laughed at it. No one even breathed in agreement. It was a question they had all been afraid to ask aloud, the one that gave shape to the dread twisting in their stomachs. Because if it was real, and they knew it was, then every word they had thrown at the old man was not just mockery, but sacrilege. Clayton didn't stop him. He stood frozen, his jaw tight, his bravado leaking away with each second of silence that followed. He wanted to believe the boy's question, wanted to nod and say yes. It must be something bought from a pawn shop or passed down through a family that didn't deserve it. Anything would be easier than admitting they had cornered and ridiculed a man who had once stood where none of them ever could. The bartender shifted behind the counter. He had heard the question too, but his face gave nothing back. His eyes remained fixed on the metal, his jaw set in a grim line. He knew better. He had seen decorations faked, stories stretched, but this was different. This one carried an aura that no imitation could copy. The way the old cowboy's hand rested over it, steady and scarred, told him more than the metal itself ever could. Harlan did not answer right away. His silence deepened, stretching long enough that the boy who had asked shifted uncomfortably, his boots scraping in the sawdust. Finally, the cowboy lifted his head, the brim of his hat rising just enough to reveal the gray of his eyes. They were calm, steady, but sharp enough to cut through the smoke and strike the young man square. "Where'd I get it?" His voice was low. Gravel rolled into syllables, worn by time but unshaken. He let the words linger before continuing, his tone carrying no boast, no anger, only truth. "They don't hand these out in shops. You don't buy M. You don't find them in pawn boxes or old trunks. You earn them, and you don't earn one without leaving pieces of yourself behind." The boy swallowed hard, his face paling. Clayton looked away, unable to meet the cowboy's gaze. His friends shifted their weight, unease crackling through them like a fire they couldn't stamp out. None of them wanted to press further. The question had been asked, and the answer, though quiet, had carved its way into the room like a blade. Eli's pencil moved again, scratching the words into his sketchbook alongside his drawings, as though writing them would keep them safe from being forgotten. He knew this was not a story that would be told in the way barroom tales usually spread, twisted and exaggerated until the truth was lost. This was something fragile, something that demanded care. He watched the old cowboy's face, the steady calm in his eyes, and he understood. The metal was not for display. It was a burden, and asking, "Where'd you get that?" was like asking him to relive what could never be put into words. The jukebox played on, its song a soft ache in the background. No one laughed now. No one dared. The metal gleamed faintly, and the old cowboy's voice lingered in the air, reminding them all the difference between what could be bought and what must be paid for in blood. The question still lingered in the air, thin and brittle, when Harlan lifted his head. Slowly, as though each movement carried the weight of years, the brim of his hat tilted back and his eyes came into view. They were gray, not the dull gray of ash, but the sharp, steady gray of stone cliffs weathered by time and storm. Eyes that had seen more than they spoke of, eyes that carried memories heavy enough to silence men who thought themselves bold. The bar seemed to contract around that gaze, the laughter long gone. The jukeboxes hummed now little more than a backdrop to something far heavier. He did not rush his words. He let the silence breathe a moment longer, meeting the stare of the man who had asked where the metal came from, holding it long enough that the younger ranch hand shifted uneasily in his boots. Then, with a voice low and even, Harlan gave his answer. Afghanistan, 1969. The syllables fell like stones into a well, each one sinking deep, deeper still, until the room was filled with the echo of what they meant. No embellishment, no story spun for effect, just a place and a time, spoken as plainly as if he had named a town down the road. But the weight behind the words was undeniable. Clayton's grin, long since gone, tightened into a grimace. He knew what those words meant, even if he had never walked a battlefield. The others understood too, if only by instinct. Afghanistan in that year was no place for the untested or the weak. It was a crucible, a fire that only a few ever came back from, and none without scars that followed them the rest of their lives. The bartender leaned forward on the counter, his jaw tightening as the truth settled. He had served drinks to plenty of men who claimed service, some real, many exaggerated. But this man had not spoken until pressed, had not offered his history until it was demanded of him. And when he did, it was not with pride, not with boast, but with the calm resignation of someone who knew that medals were bought with more than flesh and bone. They were bought with the lives of others who never came home. Eli Turner felt his pencil slow, almost stop, as he tried to steady his hand against the page. He scrawled the numbers, the year, the name of the place, as if writing them down would keep them safe. Proof against the doubt he knew others would cast when this night was only a story. His young heart beat hard against his ribs, not with fear, but with awe. He had read about wars in books, seen old photographs in magazines, but never before had he sat in the same room with someone who carried that history in his silence. The ranch hand shifted again, boots scraping against the sawdust, but now the sound was different. No rhythm of intimidation, no heavy stamping meant to taunt. It was retreat, slow and clumsy, each man taking half a step back as though space itself had become too heavy to share with him. They avoided his eyes now, unable to hold the calm gray gaze that spoke louder than their jeers ever had. Harlan did not look at them with anger, nor with triumph. His eyes carried neither. They carried only memory, the kind that sat behind the gaze of every man who had lived through something that could not be retold. He did not explain what happened in Afghanistan in 1969. He did not tell them how or why the medal had been pinned to his chest. He let the place and year stand alone, letting the silence speak the rest. The jukebox shifted into another track, its opening chords twanging sharp in the quiet. The sound jarred against the stillness, but it did not break it. Nothing could. The weight of two words, a place and a year, had settled over the bar like dust, impossible to sweep away. The metal gleamed faintly in the dim light, and Harlan's eyes, calm but filled with a history none of them could touch, stayed fixed on the space before him. None of the men dared laugh again. None dared question further. They had their answer, as much as he was willing to give. And for the first time that night, they realized it was more than enough. The case on the counter might have been small, its leather worn, its brass clasp dull with years, but what lay inside it carried more weight than any object in the room. Few men in their lifetime ever see the Medal of Honor with their own eyes. Fewer still stand in the same room as the man who earned it. The medal is not handed out lightly, not given for mere duty or courage. It is reserved for moments so far beyond comprehension that words falter in their telling. It is for acts where a man gives everything. Sometimes his life, sometimes a life he wished he could keep. And in rare instances, he survives long enough to carry the burden of the ribbon around his neck. The weight of it is not the tarnished star or the faded blue ribbon. The weight is in the memory that clings to it, in the names of the men who did not come home, in the sound of gunfire that never leaves a man's ears, in the smell of smoke and blood that lingers even decades later. To hold such a medal is not to own glory, but to shoulder the reminder of sacrifice, of choices made in seconds that carve scars into a lifetime. It is a mark of honor, yes, but also a reminder of everything taken. In 1969, Afghanistan was not a word most in the bar understood beyond whispers on the news, or half-heard talk from veterans who never spoke much about what it had been. But for Harlan Briggs, it was a place etched into his bones. That medal did not come from parades or easy victories. It came from nights when stars above the mountains gave no comfort, from mornings when the sun rose on silence, because too many had fallen the day before. It came from decisions no one should be forced to make, from moments when men younger than Eli, boys barely grown, looked to him for something to cling to while the world around them burned. The narrator's voice, if it could be given shape, would not be proud but solemn. The medal is proof not of invincibility, but of survival, and survival comes at a price. Those who wear it know the faces of the ones who cannot. They carry them in dreams, in quiet moments at bars where laughter surrounds them but never reaches them. They sit with coffee instead of whiskey because they know better than to try and drown ghosts. That is what Clayton and his friends had failed to see when they mocked the limp, the coat, the silence. They thought they were looking at weakness, at the shell of a man whose best days had crumbled into dust. What they were really looking at was the weight of history itself, compressed into the scars on his hands, the line of his shoulders, and a star in a case that spoke louder than he ever would. The Medal of Honor is not faked. It is not bought. It cannot be inherited or claimed by boasting. To possess it is to be marked forever by the moment that earned it. And though the ribbon may fade, the burden does not. Men like Harlan Briggs carry it quietly, because they know too well that to speak of is to open wounds that never truly heal. Around the bar, faces shifted as the truth settled in. The laughter was gone, replaced by the uneasy realization that they had stood in the presence of something they did not understand. They had mocked scars they could never bear, laughed at silence they could never hold. And now, with the medal glinting faintly in the dim light, they were forced to confront the truth of it, that they had mistaken endurance for fragility, and in doing so revealed their own ignorance. The jukebox hummed its tune, but no one listened. The only sound that mattered was a quiet weight of history that sat open on the counter, carried not just by the medal but by the man who refused to let it define him in words. He had survived, and survival itself was proof enough. The bartender had been leaning against the counter when Harlan first walked in, sizing him up the way he always did with strangers. The limp, the coat frayed at the seams, the boots caked with miles of dust. He had read the man as another drifter passing through, the kind who ordered the cheapest thing on the menu and left behind little more than trouble. He had muttered about it, half under his breath, but loud enough to be heard, confident in his judgment because he had seen the pattern too many times before. Now the medal sat on the counter, its dull shine cutting to the haze of cigarette smoke, and the bartender felt that judgment hollow out inside him. His throat tightened as though the weight of his own words had turned to ash. He fumbled with a rag in his hands, twisting it between his fingers, though there was no glass to polish, nothing to clean. He couldn't bring himself to look at the cowboy's eyes. He knew what he'd find there. Not anger, not even pride, but the steady, unflinching gaze of a man who had carried more than he could name. He tried to speak, to fill the silence that pressed on his chest. I didn't mean the words caught, too thin, too small. He cleared his throat and tried again, softer this time. Didn't mean nothing by what I said earlier. It was a pitiful attempt, and he knew it. The apology rang hollow because it wasn't about the words themselves, but the truth they revealed. He had dismissed a man who deserved better. The cowboy didn't answer. He didn't even turn his head. His hand rested calmly on the clothes case, the scars on his knuckles illuminated in the flicker of neon. That silence was worse than any response could have been. The bartender felt exposed beneath it, as though every assumption he had made was being laid bare for judgment. He remembered the way he had poured the coffee, sliding the chipped mug across with a smirk, as though doing the man a favor. He remembered muttering about drifters and empty pockets, convinced he had the stranger figured out. And now he saw how small he had been, how blind. That medal on the counter was a reminder not just of Harlan's history, but of his own failure to see past the surface. The ranch hands were shifting in their boots, their bravado broken. Eli was bent over his sketchbook, pencil flying. But it was the bartender who felt the sharpest sting because he had been sober. He had no excuse of drink, no excuse of youthful arrogance. He had looked at a man who carried the weight of history and seen nothing but dust and silence. His hands trembled slightly as he set the rag down, palms pressing flat against the wood as though bracing himself. He wanted to speak, to offer something more than hollow words, but nothing seemed enough. How do you apologize for reducing someone like Harlan Briggs to a stereotype, for failing to recognize the quiet strength sitting right in front of you? He had spent years tending this bar, watching men come and go, thinking he could read them all. Tonight had proved him wrong. Finally, he managed a whisper, one that barely carried across the counter. "Shouldn't have judged you." He said it without lifting his eyes, unable to face the man whose silence weighed heavier than reproach. The word sounded fragile, a confession rather than an excuse. Still, Harlan didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence carried the truth well enough. The bartender's regret was his own to live with. The metal on the counter had already answered everything that mattered. The bartender turned slightly, pretending to reach for a bottle on the shelf, his face hidden in the mirror's reflection. He could not meet the cowboy's eyes, not tonight. The shame of having dismissed him, of having seen nothing but a drifter where there was a soldier, where there was sacrifice, sat heavier than the smell of whiskey that clung to the air. He busied himself with meaningless tasks, but his ears caught every sound. The scratch of Eli's pencil, the uneven breaths of the ranch hands, the hum of the jukebox, and over it all, the steady silence of the man he had misjudged. It would stay with him, he knew, long after the metal was gone from sight, long after the cowboy walked back out into the desert night. The silence in the bar begged for more. It pressed against Harlan, as though the men standing around him believed they were owed something now, owed the story behind the metal, owed the details of how a man like him had come to carry it. But Harlan did not move to satisfy their hunger. He did not lift his head higher, did not lean forward with tales of heroism. His hand stayed on the case, steady and unmoving, and the message was clear enough. There would be no story tonight. That was the thing about medals, about honors carved from violence. People thought they came with legends attached, with stories that could be told over whiskey and smoke. They imagined acts of glory, brave words shouted into fire, victories carved clean out of chaos. They wanted to hear about battles, as if they were parables, as if the pain behind them could be turned into entertainment. But Harlan knew better. The truth was not something that could be shared in a barroom without staining every ear that heard it. The truth was not something to be told at all. He remembered, even now, the mountains of Afghanistan, the thin air that burned his lungs, the echo of gunfire bouncing off the ridges. He remembered the faces of men who had looked to him for something, leadership, courage, maybe even hope, faces he never saw again. He remembered the day when everything went wrong, when the ground itself seemed to turn against them, and he had done what he could not explain even to himself. The metal had come from that day, pinned to his chest by hands that told him he had done something worthy of remembrance. But he had never believed it. To him, the metal was a reminder of the men who did not come home, of the screams that still haunted his dreams, of the blood he had not been able to wash from his hands. So he stayed silent. He let the room lean in, waiting, but he gave them nothing. Not the number of men he had seen fall, not the sound of the explosions, not the smell of fire clinging to his skin. Those were stories left untold, locked away where they belonged. His silence was not weakness. It was mercy. Mercy for himself, for the memories he refused to drag back into the light, and mercy for them, the men who thought they wanted to know, but had no idea what knowing would cost. The ranch hands shifted uneasily, their bravado already broken, their curiosity gnawing at them now. Clayton opened his mouth as though to ask again, but the words died in his throat when Harlan's eyes flicked toward him. There was no anger in that look, only a weight that made his chest tighten. It was a look of a man who had seen too much and chosen silence, because words could never bridge the gap between those who had lived it and those who had not. Eli, sketchbook in hand, understood in a way the others could not. He watched the cowboy's silence and recognized it for what it was, a refusal, not a void. The boy's pencil scratched the page with softer lines now, shading shadows across Harlan's face, capturing the depth of quiet that spoke louder than any story ever could. He didn't need the details to know the truth. The truth was in the way the man held himself, in the scars across his hands, in the metal that rested like a burden on the counter. The bartender didn't press either. He had already felt the sting of his own judgment and had no desire to add to it by demanding words a man had no wish to give. He poured himself a glass of water instead, drank it slowly, and let the silence stand. The jukebox played on, another song about leaving and loss, its verses filling the space where stories might have gone. The room breathed with it, each man and woman aware that they were in the presence of something vast and untouchable. They wanted to know more, but they would not. Harlan's silence was final, unbroken, and it told them more than words ever could. The day he should have died was not theirs to hear. Eli had been sketching in quick strokes, trying to capture what the metal itself meant. The weight of men's faces had gone rigid with shame, the weight of silence in the room. But as his pencil moved, his eyes wandered back to the cowboy himself. Harlan sat as still as ever, his hand resting on the case, his shoulders squared in a way that betrayed nothing but endurance. Yet when the boy looked closer, he noticed something the others hadn't. The way the fabric of the man's shirt pulled tight across his chest when he breathed. The old coat had been torn earlier. It seemed ripped open by Clayton's reckless hand, and the shirt beneath was exposed in the light. Through the thin cloth, faint outlines pressed against the material, uneven ridges that did not belong to muscle or bone. Eli's heart skipped as he realized what he was seeing. Scars. Not the clean scars of old cuts or scratches, but jagged shapes, clustered in patterns that told a different story altogether. The boy had seen pictures in library books, photographs of veterans who carried pieces of war inside them for the rest of their lives. Shrapnel, the fragments of explosions that tore through flesh and left behind maps of pain that never truly healed. He could see them now, faint but unmistakable, pressing against the fabric each time Harlan's chest rose with a breath. The boy's pencil trembled again as he tried to sketch what he saw, careful not to let his hand falter. He drew the way the shirt pulled tight, the uneven texture beneath it, the subtle outline of wounds too deep to be forgotten. He knew no one else in the bar was looking that closely. The ranch hands were still staring at the metal, their bravado cracked wide open. The bartender couldn't lift his eyes at all. But Eli saw, and he felt the weight of it settle into his stomach like a stone. Those scars explained more than words ever could. They explained the limp, the steady way Harlan moved as though every action carried a reminder of pain. They explained the silence, the refusal to tell stories of battles long past. The scars were the stories, carved into his body, carried with him every day. Eli knew instinctively that the man had nearly died, that his body had once been torn open by fire and metal, and yet here he was, still breathing, still carrying himself with a dignity that none of the men around the pool table could claim. Harlan adjusted slightly on the stool, and the shirt shifted again, the scars catching the light beneath the fabric. For the briefest moment, Eli thought the man knew he had been seen. His eyes flicked toward the window where the boy sat, and though no words passed between them, Eli felt a kind of understanding in that glance. It was as though the cowboy was saying, asterisk, yes, it's there, but it's mine to carry, not yours to ask about, asterisk. The boy lowered his eyes to the page, his pencil scratching furiously now, not wanting to lose the shape of what he had witnessed. He shaded the scars lightly, careful not to overdraw them, as if even on paper they deserved a measure of respect. His hand shook, but he pressed on, determined to capture what no one else would believe. The ranch hands didn't notice. They were still standing in the shadow of the metal, their pride stripped bare, their laughter long gone. Clayton's mouth worked soundlessly, his hands gripping the cue stick, as though it could anchor him. None of them dared step forward again. The bartender poured himself another glass of water and downed it quickly, his back turned, his shoulders heavy with regret. But Eli kept watching, kept sketching, because he knew that scars like those were not meant for the world to see. They had been revealed only by accident, by the tearing of coat and the pulling of fabric, and once the night ended, they would vanish again into secrecy. He felt a responsibility he couldn't name, to preserve what he'd seen, to remember it, because he understood that silence often hid the deepest truths. The jukebox played on, a slow song about roads that stretched too far, its verses filling the air like dust carried on the wind. And in the dim light of the bar, with smoke curling toward the ceiling and silence pressing against every wall, the boy drew the outline of scars beneath his shirt, knowing he was witnessing something sacred, something that belonged to history as much as to the man himself. The men who had circled Harlan drifted back now, their boots dragging slowly through the sawdust, no longer stamping in rhythm, no longer eager to show their dominance. They retreated toward the pool table where their cues lay forgotten, their shoulders hunched, their voices lowered to whispers that carried only to each other. The bravado that fueled them minutes earlier was gone, replaced with unease, their laughter silenced by the weight of the metal and the scars they could not ignore. Clayton leaned against the edge of the table, his hands gripping the wood so tightly that his knuckles whitened. His face, usually so quick to flash a smirk, was drawn and pale now. He bent his head toward the others, his voice low, but the hush of the bar carried even whispers. That was real," he muttered. "That wasn't no trinket." His friends nodded, their eyes flicking back toward the counter where Harlan sat. None of them dared to say otherwise. They knew it, felt it in their bones. The younger one, the one who had first asked where the metal came from, swallowed hard. "We mocked him," he whispered. "Called him old, weak," limped around like he was finished. His words shook as though admitting them out loud made the shame heavier. "He's done more than all of us ever will." The heavier man, sweat still shining on his flushed face, shifted uncomfortably. "More than us put together," he muttered back, his voice rough. "That metal ain't given for nothing. You gotta save men, do the impossible." He cut himself off, shaking his head. The words felt too big in his mouth. Clayton tried to force a laugh, but it died halfway out. "We didn't know," he hissed, though the excuse rang hollow. Not knowing didn't make their mockery vanish. Not knowing didn't erase the image of their boots grinding the sawdust around a man who had once walked through fire and carried others out with him. The whispers deepened, urgent and hushed, each man desperate to convince himself the shame could be pushed aside. They told each other they hadn't meant it, that it was just drink talking, that they hadn't known what sat hidden in the old man's coat. But beneath the excuses, the truth clung like smoke. They had mocked a hero, a man who had bled and scarred for things they couldn't even imagine. Across the room, Eli caught pieces of their whispering as he sketched, his pencil scratching steadily on the page. He saw the way their faces had changed, no longer smug but unsettled, drawn tight with the realization of what they had done. He noted it in the tilt of their shoulders, the way their eyes wouldn't meet Harlan's. His pencil moved quickly, recording not just the cowboy but the men around him, their shame as much a part of the scene as the metal itself. The bartender heard too. He pretended to busy himself with bottles, but his ears caught the low voices, the fear wrapped in their words. He felt no pity for them. They had chosen cruelty when they believed the man was beneath them. Now they had to carry the truth that they had spat on someone who had already borne more than they ever would. The whispers carried on, circling among the men who had thought themselves bold, their voices frayed with guilt. "We can't stay here," one muttered. "Not after this." Another shifted, staring down at his boots as though the sawdust might swallow him. Clayton shook his head, his pride unwilling to let him flee. But even he couldn't disguise the tremor in his hands. Harlan did not look their way. He didn't need to. His silence had done its work. He sat steady at the counter, his hand still resting on the clothes case, his coffee untouched, his eyes fixed on nothing and everything all at once. He did not rise, did not boast, did not demand an apology. The weight of the metal had already stripped the men bare, and their whispers in the corner proved it. The jukebox hummed on, the song turning slow and mournful. The air in the bar was heavy, carrying the stench of smoke and whiskey, but beneath it was something else, something unspoken. The knowledge that their mockery had been small, their pride smaller still, and the man they had targeted stood quietly above them all. Harlan sat motionless for a long while after the whispers began. He did not need to turn his head to know what was being said. The tone carried far enough. The hushed admissions, the nervous edges of men who had suddenly realized the smallness of their voices in the shadow of something larger than themselves. He let it wash over him without response, his silence the same as it had always been. Then, slowly, almost as if it pained him, he reached into the inside pocket of his torn coat. The motion was deliberate. His fingers moved with the care of someone handling something fragile, something that mattered more than the weight of metal or the judgment of strangers. From the pocket, he pulled not another case, nor anything that glittered, but a simple wallet, the leather soft and worn with years of use. He set it on the counter beside the closed metal case and opened it slowly, thumbing through the few contents it carried until he found what he wanted. He drew out a small photograph, the corners bent, the surface creased from being folded and unfolded countless times. The image was faded, its colors washed away into tones of sepia and gray, but the faces were still clear enough. A group of young men, no older than Clayton himself, stood in fatigues against a backdrop of jagged mountains. Some grinned at the camera, their expressions full of bravado. Others looked more serious, their eyes already carrying the knowledge that not all of them would survive what lay ahead. Harlan placed the photo gently on the counter, resting his hand beside it as though anchoring it there. The metal had silenced the room, but the photograph deepened that silence into something heavier. Eli leaned forward, straining to see, his sketchbook trembling in his hands. The boy caught sight of the faces, row after row of young men whose names he would never know, whose lives had been tied together in that frozen moment. Most of them did not come home. Harlan didn't need to say it. The truth was written in the way he looked at the picture, his eyes fixed on the faces of boys who had once been his brothers. The gray of his gaze softened, though it did not waver, as he traced the photo with a finger, moving slowly across each row as if counting them again. His silence told the story more clearly than words could have. Clayton and his friends stared from their corner, their bravado crumbling further with each passing second. They had thought themselves men, proud of their work on ranches and their ability to drink hard and laugh louder. But here was proof of real manhood, of sacrifice beyond their imagining. Captured forever in a photograph carried close to the heart a man they had called weak. The weight of it pressed down on them, leaving their faces hollow and pale. The bartender leaned closer now, his regret deepening. He could see the lines on the photograph, the way the young men stood shoulder to shoulder, the way time had trapped them in a moment before the world broke them. He knew that when Harlan looked at it, he wasn't just remembering. He was carrying them still, each one, in every step of his limp, in every scar beneath his shirt, in every silence he held. Eli sketched furiously, his pencil flying across the page, capturing the photograph in miniature, the outline of the men standing proud and unknowing of the fates that awaited them. He wanted to keep it, to remember it, to ensure their faces didn't vanish when the night ended. He could feel the weight of history pressing against him. And though he was just a boy, he understood that this moment was not about medals or silence alone. It was about the lives hidden inside a photograph, carried by a man who had outlived them. The jukebox played another verse, low and mournful, but no one heard the words. The bar had grown still again, every eye fixed on the faded photo and the cowboy who carried it. No one asked questions. No one dared. The truth of the picture was enough. Most of those young men had not come home, and the one who had sat in their place carried the burden for all of them. The photograph lay on the counter beside the closed metal case, the dim neon light falling across its creased surface. It seemed to hold the entire room hostage. No one laughed anymore. No one jeered. The air hung thick with smoke and something heavier still, guilt. Every man and woman in that bar felt it pressing against their skin, forcing them to reckon with the truth of what had been revealed. The silence stretched long enough that the jukebox's song felt almost unbearable, its sorrowful verses filling every corner like a reminder that nothing could erase what had been said, or the man they had mocked. It was Clayton who broke first, though not with words of defiance. His boots shifted across the sawdust as he took a half step forward, his head lowered, his bravado gone. His voice, when it came, was small, nothing like the loud bravado he had shouted across the room earlier. Didn't know, he muttered, his eyes fixed on the floor. Didn't mean. His words trailed off, unfinished, as if he couldn't summon the courage to look Harlan in the eye. One of his friends, older, leaner, and less sure of himself now, followed his lead. He took a step closer to the counter, his hat twisting nervously in his hands. "Sir," he said, the word catching his throat as though it were foreign to him. We were wrong." His voice cracked, and he stopped there, unable to say more. Others could not bring themselves to face it. The heavier one, cheeks red and eyes darting, turned away sharply. He grabbed his coat from the back of a chair, muttering something under his breath, and pushed his way toward the door. His boots dragged through the sawdust, leaving a crooked trail as he left without looking back. Another followed quickly, his face tight with shame, unwilling to stay and have the weight of the old cowboy silence bear down on him any longer. The door opened, letting in a gust of desert air, and shut behind them with a hollow thud. The bartender stood frozen behind the counter, torn between stepping forward and keeping his distance. He had already felt the sting of his own misjudgment, the regret heavy in his chest. But shame held him still. He busied his hands again, polishing a glass that didn't need polishing, as if motion alone could hide his hesitation. His eyes, however, betrayed him. They never left the photograph, never strayed far from the scarred hand resting beside it. Eli Turner watched from his corner, sketchbook open on his lap, his pencil moving in quick, deliberate strokes. He captured the divide as it unfolded. Clayton inching forward but unable to lift his head, one man standing with hat in hand, others slipping away through the door, their pride crumbling into silence. He drew the bartender too, caught between guilt and awe, his rag clenched in his hand. The boy's heart pounded with the sense that he was recording more than a moment. He was capturing the line that separated those who could face the truth from those who could not. The room felt split in two. On one side were those who shuffled closer, haltingly, trying their clumsy way to offer something like apology, their voices small, their bodies uneasy. On the other side were the ones who fled, who chose the comfort of denial and distance rather than endure the weight of the cowboy's silence. Neither group found peace. The apologies rang hollow against the scars in the metal, and the retreating footsteps carried shame that would follow them long after the night ended. Through it all, Harlan did not move. He didn't acknowledge the apologies, didn't glance at the door where others slipped out. His eyes remained on the photograph, the faintest shadow of sorrow in his gaze. He let the bar divide itself. Let each man choose how to bear his own guilt. His silence said what needed saying, that nothing could undo the words spoken, and no apology or retreat would ever balance the scale. The jukebox hummed on, another song beginning, its slow rhythm underscoring the division that had settled in the room. Those who stayed shifted nervously, their eyes lowered. Those who had gone would carry the memory with them, unspoken but unforgettable. And in the middle of it all, the old cowboy sat steady at the counter, the photograph of his brothers in arms beside him, a reminder of the line between those who had sacrificed everything and those who had never understood what sacrifice meant. The division in the room lingered, even after the door had shut on the ones who could not stay. Those who remained stood quietly, their weight shifting uneasily from one boot to the other, their eyes drawn back to the counter, but never daring to meet the cowboy's gaze. The jukebox played a softer tune now, a voice low and aching, but no one seemed to hear it. All attention clung to the man with the torn coat, the metal case, and the photograph of a unit frozen in youth. His silence was its own kind of gravity, and the others could do little but orbit it awkwardly. In the corner, Eli Turner sat with his sketchbook open, the pencil in his hand worn almost to a stub. He had drawn furiously all evening, capturing the shifting faces, the scarred hands, the outlines beneath the cowboy's shirt that told more than words ever could. Yet none of it felt complete. The pages were filled with fragments, moments frozen in lines and shading, but he knew they were only half the truth. He had sketched the way others saw the man, the way mockery or shame bent their perceptions. What he wanted was different. He wanted to capture the cowboy as he truly was, unshaken, scarred, enduring. He swallowed hard, his throat tight, the weight of the room pressing on his young shoulders. His hand trembled slightly, not from fear of the man, but from the courage it took to speak in a place where silence had ruled so long. Finally, his voice rose, small but steady. "Sir," the word cracked slightly, drawing a few glances from men who had been whispering among themselves. Eli's eyes stayed fixed on the cowboy at the counter. Harlan turned his head slowly, his gray eyes meeting the boy's. There was no judgment in them, no sharp edge, only the steady calm that seemed to hold everything in place. Eli gripped his sketchbook tighter, pressing the pencil against the paper until the lead dug deep. "Can I?" He hesitated, his voice barely carrying. "Can I draw you? Properly. Not how they saw you, but how you really are." The words hung fragile in the air, a question no one else would have thought to ask. A hush followed them, the kind of hush that wasn't forced but born of genuine surprise. Even Clayton, leaning back against the pool table, lifted his head at the sound, his expression caught between confusion and something softer. Harlan studied the boy for a long moment. His eyes lingered on the sketchbook, then lifted back to Eli's face. In those gray depths there was a flicker, something that might have been sorrow or gratitude, or both at once. He didn't answer immediately. He let the silence breathe, as though measuring the request, weighing whether such a thing mattered in the balance of a long life. Finally, he gave the faintest nod. It was not a grand gesture, not permission shouted for the room to hear. Just a slow, deliberate nod, his gaze steady on the boy. His voice followed, quiet but firm. "If you want to draw me, son, draw the medal too. Not for me, for the men who ain't here." Eli's chest tightened, his pencil shaking as he pressed it to page. He nodded quickly, his eyes burning, and began to sketch again, slower this time, deliberate. He shaped the man not as a drifter hunched in silence, but as someone who carried weight no one else in the room could shoulder. He drew the scars beneath the shirt, the steady eyes, the hand resting on the case, and beside it the faint outline of the photograph, the faces of men who had not returned. The bar stayed hushed while he worked, every sound of pencil on paper echoing louder than the jukebox. The ranch hands watched in silence, some with guilt still etched into their faces, others with quiet respect. The bartender leaned on the counter, his eyes lowered but his ears tuned to every scratch of graphite. And at the center of it all sat Harlan Briggs, still and steady, allowing himself, for the first time that night, to be seen as he truly was. The pencil worked steadily in Eli's hand, each line more careful than the last, his sketchbook resting against the table as though the page itself was too fragile to carry what he was trying to capture. The boy's eyes moved from the paper to the man at the counter and back again, tracing the quiet dignity in Harlan's posture, the weight of his silence, the scars just visible beneath the torn shirt. Every detail mattered, but more than the lines and shadows. Eli was trying to capture something unspoken, the truth of who the cowboy was, not what others had mistaken him for. When the scratching of graphite slowed, he lifted his head, unsure if he had permission to say more. The ranch hands were still huddled in their corner, whispering among themselves, shame etched across their faces. The bartender busied himself with glass he had already cleaned twice, his eyes darting toward the metal case, and then away again, as if the sight of it made his chest tighten. The whole room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the cowboy's next move. Harlan sat quietly, his hand resting on the closed leather case, his gaze lowered to the photograph that still lay beside it. His fingers traced the edges of the picture slowly, almost unconsciously, the way a man might trace a scar that never quite healed. Then he lifted his head, his gray eyes scanning the room, not to shame them, not to gloat, but to meet them one by one, letting them feel the weight of his steady calm. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and even, gravel-worn smooth by time. "That medal," he said, tapping the case lightly with two fingers, "ain't mine." The words fell heavy in the stillness, each syllable deliberate. He let them linger a moment before continuing. "It belongs to the men who never made it back." The bar went quiet again, though it had never truly shaken free from silence. This time, the stillness deepened, pulled down by the truth behind his words. No one shifted, no one whispered. The jukebox hummed a slow tune, but even its music seemed distant, drowned beneath the weight of the old cowboy's answer. He didn't elaborate, didn't tell their names, didn't recount the night that carved scars into his chest and put the medal into his keeping. He only kept his eyes steady, his tone unshaken. "They pinned it on me, but it weren't for me. It was for the ones who gave more than I ever could. Boys younger than most of you, who had no business dying where they did. That ribbon's theirs. I just carry it." The bartender lowered his glass slowly, setting it on the counter with hands that no longer trembled from shame, but from something closer to reverence. He found himself staring at the case again, his throat too tight to speak. Clayton and his friends avoided each other's eyes, their faces hollowed out by the truth they had been forced to face. Eli's pencil trembled, his heart pounding as he tried to capture the words on paper as much as the image on the page. Harlan leaned back slightly on the stool, his coat hanging open, the scars beneath his shirt pulling faintly with the movement. His hand stayed on the case, but his eyes shifted to the photograph again, lingering on the faces frozen in youth. "They deserve better than me sitting here with coffee in silence," he said softly, almost to himself. "But I'll carry it till I can't anymore. That's the only promise I can keep." No one interrupted. No one dared to. They knew instinctively that the words were not meant for them alone, but for the men in the photograph, for the ghost Harlan carried. The metal on the counter had already silenced them, but his answer carved the silence into something permanent, something none of them would ever forget. Eli's eyes burned as he bent over his sketchbook again, writing the words beneath the drawing in careful letters. It belongs to men who never made it back. He knew that was the truth that mattered most, the truth he would carry long after this night ended. The song faded on the jukebox, its last chord hanging faintly in the smoky air before the machine clicked off with a hollow clunk. The sound echoed strangely loud, and then there was nothing. No laughter, no muttering, no clatter of glasses or pool balls to fill the space. The silence was deeper than anything the bar had known in years, a silence that seemed to settle into the very walls, pressing down on every man and woman inside. It was not the comfortable silence of late nights when the crowd thinned and fatigue dulled conversation. It was heavier, almost unbearable, because it came not from peace but from realization. Every man knew what he had just witnessed, what had been revealed at the far end of the counter, and every man knew what he himself had done or failed to do when the old cowboy had first walked in. Clayton Murdoch stood nearest the pool table, his cue still leaning where he had dropped it earlier. His shoulders sagged, his hat pulled low, as though hiding his face could erase what he had said. The smirk that had been fixed on his lips all night was gone, replaced with a stiff line that refused to relax. He didn't dare look toward the counter, but the weight of the silence made it impossible not to feel the eyes of everyone else on him, waiting to see if he would move, if he would speak. His friends fared no better. The younger one shifted from foot to foot, his arms crossed tightly against his chest, as if bracing himself against something. The heavier one stared at the door, his jaw tight, clearly wishing he had left for the others who hadn't been able to bear staying. None of them found comfort in the silence. It trapped them, holding them accountable without a word spoken. The bartender tried to busy himself, but even the simple act of reaching for a bottle sounded too loud in the hush. He stopped, his hand hovering in the air before lowering it again. He let out a slow breath and leaned against the counter, his eyes drawn unwillingly back to the man who had shattered his assumptions so thoroughly. He couldn't meet Harlan's eyes, but he also couldn't look away from the metal case and the photograph. He felt the silence pressing against his chest like a confession he couldn't take back. At the window, Eli Turner's pencil had stilled. His sketchbook rested on his lap, the page unfinished, but he didn't move to continue it. His young face was pale, his eyes wide, drinking in the stillness of the room. He had been to this bar more times than he could count, and never once had he seen it without noise. To him, the silence was its own kind of proof that what had just been revealed was too great for anyone to deny. He shifted the sketchbook slightly, glancing at the lines he had already drawn, and knew he had captured enough. The rest was carved into memory. Harlan Briggs sat unmoving at the far stool, his hand resting on the clothes case, his eyes fixed somewhere past the photograph. He wasn't looking for pity, and he wasn't seeking respect. He sat the way he always had, silent, steady, as if the room's reaction mattered little compared to the ghosts he carried. The quiet suited him. It was what he knew, what he lived in. The men around him were only now discovering what silence could mean, and it made them uneasy. The barroom's air seemed to grow thicker with every second, the smell of smoke and whiskey clinging heavier. Someone coughed softly, then fell still again. No one dared break the quiet. Words would have sounded weak against the truth of the metal, the photograph, and the scars beneath the cowboy's shirt. No apology could balance the scales. No excuse could soften the shame. All that remained was silence, and in that silence lay something close to awe. For once, the bar had no noise to offer, no bravado to cover the truth. It stood still and awaited a man who had carried more than anyone that could ever imagine, and in that stillness, every person was left alone with his own thoughts, ashamed of laughter struck by the enormity of what had been revealed, humbled by the simple presence of a cowboy who asked for nothing. The bar stayed hushed, the kind of silence that crept into a man's bones and made every sound feel too loud. The jukebox sat dark, its needle resting still, the air heavy with smoke and the faint buzz of the neon sign over the door. Harlan remained at the far stool, his hand resting on the leather case, the photograph close by. He hadn't moved in minutes, and no one dared disturb him. Even Clayton, who had filled the room earlier with taunts, kept his head down. His pride shrunk into something small and uneasy. The bartender finally shifted. His hands, which had been restless all night, fussing with rags and glasses that didn't need cleaning, came to rest on the counter. He stared at Harlan for a long moment, his mouth tightening as though weighing a decision. Then, without a word, he reached for a bottle on the shelf. It was not the cheapest he had, nor the most expensive, but a bottle he reserved for men he respected, men he considered worth the gesture. He pulled down a short glass, clean and clear, and poured a measure of whiskey that caught the light as it filled. The sound of the pour seemed loud in the quiet, the faint glug of amber liquid hitting glass, turning heads before anyone realized what it was. The bartender slid it across the counter with slow care, the glass gliding across the wood until it came to a stop in front of Harlan. He didn't say anything at first. He just let the gesture sit there, the weight of it heavier than words. When he did speak, his voice was low and steady. "On the house." Harlan didn't move right away. His eyes stayed fixed on the photograph, his hand still resting over the metal case. For a moment it seemed as though he hadn't heard, or maybe that he intended to ignore it. But then, slowly, his gaze shifted toward the glass. He studied it with the same steady calm he had shown all night, the gray of his eyes unreadable. Whiskey was a drink that carried its own ghosts. Too many men had drowned themselves in it, trying to quiet the memories that never left. Harlan had chosen coffee instead, plain and bitter, a drink that didn't ask him to forget. The bartender waited, his hands braced against the counter, his eyes lowered slightly in something close to respect. Harlan lifted his scarred hand from the case and wrapped his fingers around the glass. For a moment, he simply held it, his grip firm but not hurried, the weight of it resting in his palm as though he were deciding whether or not to let himself remember. Finally, he raised it slowly, the amber liquid catching the dim light, and took a sip. The whiskey burned as it went down, sharp and hot, but Harlan did not flinch. He let it linger in his chest, his gaze turning distant, his eyes unfocused as though they were fixed on a place far from the sawdust and smoke of the bar. Perhaps he saw the jagged ridges of mountains half a world away. Perhaps he saw the faces in the photograph standing beside him again, young and alive, their laughter ringing against the stone. The glass in his hand became a bridge between memory and the present, and for a moment the silence deepened. No one dared to move as they watched him drink. He set the glass back down with care, the sound of it against was small but final. He did not speak, did not thank the bartender, though gratitude was there in the faint nod he gave. The bartender returned the nod, his jaw tight, his eyes glistening faintly in the smoke. No one else dared break the quiet. The gesture, simple as it was, felt larger than any apology could have. Harlan reached again for the photograph, sliding it closer, his fingers brushing across the faces frozen in time. The whiskey sat beside it, amber and still, a companion to the ghosts he carried. For the first time that night, he allowed himself a second sip, not enough to drown, not enough to forget, just enough to honor memory, to remind himself he was still here, still breathing, still carrying what the others could not. The rest of the room stayed quiet, every man caught between shame and awe, watching as a cowboy sipped whiskey with the weight of history in his eyes. The scrape of Eli's pencil had been the only sound in the room, besides a faint hum of neon and the soft clink of glass on wood. Page after page in his sketchbook had filled with fragments of the night, the jeering faces around the pool table, the scarred hands around a coffee mug, the metal glinting in the dim light, the photograph of young men frozen in youth. But as the silence deepened and the whiskey glass sat half full beside the metal case, Eli knew he had captured enough. He pressed the sketchbook closed, the worn cover folding over the pages as though sealing them away. His hand lingered on it, his fingers trembling, before he drew in a shaky breath and looked toward the counter. Harlan still sat steady, his shoulders square despite the torn coat, his eyes calm though shadowed by memory. The bar had not found its noise again. Not a man dared to speak. The ranch hands stayed near the pool table, whispers dried up, shame pulling their faces downward. The bartender leaned back against the counter, his eyes lowered, his glass forgotten. In the stillness, Eli felt something stir inside him, something that told him the moment needed more than silence, more than sketches on paper. The boy rose slowly from his chair by the window, the legs of the stool scraping softly against the floor. Every head turned, surprised by the sound, but Eli hardly noticed. His sketchbook clutched tight to his chest. He took a few steps closer, his sneakers stirring the sawdust as he moved. His throat felt tight, his heart hammering, but he didn't stop. He came to a halt a few paces from the counter, just far enough that he still had to look up at the man who had silenced them all. For a moment he simply stood there, his lips pressed together, his eyes fixed on Harlan. Then, slowly and awkwardly, Eli lifted his right hand. His fingers trembled as he straightened them against his brow, his elbows sticking out at an angle too sharp, his posture clumsy and uncertain. But his intention was clear. It was a salute, untutored, imperfect, but full of something that carried more weight than the laughter that had filled the room earlier. The gesture hung in the stillness, fragile but steady. For Harlan, it was louder than the jeers, stronger than the mockery. It was a recognition that asked for nothing in return, a boy's way of giving honor in the only form he knew. The cowboy's gray eyes lifted to meet the salute, and for the first time that night, something in them shifted. They softened, not with pride or boast, but with a quiet acknowledgement. He gave a small nod, the kind that passed between soldiers who did not need words to understand one another. Clayton and his friends watched from the corner, their shame deepening as the boy's clumsy salute cut sharper than any rebuke could have. The bartender swallowed hard, his eyes wet as he turned away, unable to watch without feeling his own failures exposed. The silence remained, but it was no longer heavy with dread. It had been reshaped into something else, respect, unspoken but undeniable. Eli's hand trembled as he held the salute, his face pale but his eyes steady. He didn't drop it until Harlan lowered his gaze back to the photograph, his nod complete. Then the boy's arm fell, stiff and awkward, and he hugged the sketchbook tighter against his chest. He turned, not back to the corner, but toward the door, his steps light but sure. He had done what none of the men had dared. He had given the cowboy the only honor he could. For Harlan, it carried more weight than the mockery ever had, more even than the hollow apologies whispered in shame. The boy's salute was clumsy, yes, but it was honest, and in that honesty lay something that had been missing all night. Recognition that the medal on the counter was not about glory, but about sacrifice, and that the man who carried it was worthy of quiet respect. The hours slipped away without anyone noticing. What had begun as a night of noise and mockery ended in a silence that held the room like a chain. The ranch hands had retreated to their corner, their voices long since quieted, their pride shattered under the weight of the medal and the photograph that needed no explanation. The bartender leaned against the counter, his rag forgotten, his eyes heavy with regret. And in the corner, Eli clutched the sketchbook as though it were more valuable than anything else he owned, his heart still racing from the salute he had given. Harlan sat where he had all night, steady as stone, the case and photograph before him, the glass of whiskey resting half empty at his side. He had not spoken again after telling him the medal was not his, that it belonged to the man who had never come home. He had let that truth stand, and the room had accepted it in silence. There was nothing more to add, nothing more to say. Then, slowly, the first light of morning slipped through the dusty window panes, streaking the smoke-filled bar with pale gold. The neon signs still buzzed, their light weaker against the dawn, but no one turned them off. All eyes were drawn to the far stool when Harlan shifted, his boots scraping against the sawdust as he rose. The sound was soft, yet in the quiet it seemed loud, carrying to every corner of the bar. He reached for the photograph first, sliding it carefully back into his wallet, folding it as though it were the most fragile thing in the world. Then he picked up the leather case, tucking it inside his coat with a movement so deliberate it seemed ritual. His hand lingered for a moment over the spot, as if steadying himself before letting the fabric fall back into place. He lifted the brim of his hat with one hand, the faintest of gestures to the room around him, and placed it back firmly on his head. No one spoke. The ranch hands lowered their eyes, unable to meet his. The bartender's throat worked as though words wanted to come, but he stayed quiet, knowing nothing he could say would measure up. Eli, still clutching his sketchbook, sat forward in his chair, his young eyes wide as if trying to memorize every detail of the man's departure. Harlan stepped toward the door. Each bootfall crunched against the sawdust, slow and steady, echoing in the stillness. The same sound that had once drawn jeers now drew only silence, each step carrying weight that seemed to linger behind him. He passed the pool table, the men parting instinctively to give him space, their faces drawn tight with shame. He did not glance at them. He did not need to. His silence spoke for him. The door creaked as he pushed it open, a faint gust of desert air spilling inside. The first rays of sun stretched across the threshold, painting his figure in gold. He paused for a heartbeat, tipping his hat slightly, a gesture of farewell that held neither bitterness nor pride. Then he stepped outside into the morning. The door swung shut behind him with a heavy thud, and for a long moment no one moved. The bar was changed, though no one could put words to how. The laughter that had once filled it now seemed impossible, an intrusion on something sacred. The silence left behind was not uncomfortable, but solemn, the kind that demanded respect. Outside, the desert morning stretched wide, the horizon pale with the promise of day. Harlan Briggs walked into it with the same steady gait he had carried all night, his limp slowing but never halting him, the weight of memory riding with him as always. Inside, every man and woman sat still, carrying their own weight now. The memory of the night they mocked a cowboy and discovered instead the measure of a soldier. And as his boots faded into the distance, the silence inside the bar held. It followed him, not laughter, not jeers, but quiet that would remain long after he was gone.